The mud told stories. In the Moselle River Valley in September 1944, German intelligence officers had learned to read it like a language. Tank treads meant armor. Boot prints meant infantry. The depth of an impression told you the load a man was carrying. The spacing between footfalls told you whether he was walking or running, rested or exhausted. For Wehrmacht trackers operating in occupied France, the ground itself was an informant, and it had never lied to them, until now. On the morning of September 14, 1944, a German patrol of 12 men moved through the tree line east of Arnaville, France, following what should have been an obvious trail left by an American reconnaissance unit. The trail was perfect. Boot prints, cigarette butts, discarded ration tins. The kind of careless evidence that American soldiers left everywhere, or so they'd been told. The patrol moved fast, confident. Oberst Heinrich Bauer had written in his morning report that catching this American unit would take perhaps 2 hours. It took 0, because the Americans weren't ahead of them. They had never been ahead of them. Every piece of evidence on that trail had been placed there deliberately, by men who understood that the fastest way to defeat a superior force is to make them chase a ghost. How does a unit of American soldiers and outnumbered, cut off, and fighting in enemy-held territory turn their own vulnerability into a weapon? That is the question this story answers. And the answer starts with one man, one principle, and a tactical doctrine so effective that German commanders would spend the rest of the war trying to understand what had hit them. Part 1. The weight of the mission. By the first week of September 1944, General George S. Patton's Third Army had done something military historians would spend decades calling impossible. In 76 days following the Normandy breakout, Third Army had advanced over 400 miles, liberated tens of thousands of square kilometers of French territory, and destroyed or captured more than a dozen German divisions. The speed was unprecedented. The logistics were a nightmare, and by mid-September both problems had converged into a single brutal reality. The Third Army had outrun its own fuel supply. Patton's tanks sat idle across a front that stretched from the Loire River to the Moselle. The Germans, for the first time since Normandy, had time to breathe, consolidate, and build something they hadn't managed since June: a coherent defensive line. The Moselle River crossings became everything. If Patton could force crossings at multiple points simultaneously, particularly at Dornot and Arnaville, he could shatter the German line before it hardened, push into the Lorraine, and position Third Army for the drive toward the Rhine. The crossings were not a good option. They were the only option. Every day the Germans were allowed to dig in was a day they became exponentially harder to dislodge. This is the strategic context that landed on the desk of Captain James F. Hollis, 35th Infantry Division, 12th Corps, 3rd Army, on September 10, 1944. Hollis was 29 years old. He had grown up in Terre Haute, Indiana, and the son of a machinist who had taught him that a good tool does exactly what it needs to do, and nothing more. No wasted motion, no wasted effort. That philosophy had followed Hollis from his father's workshop into the United States Army, where it had made him the kind of officer who thought 3 moves ahead and explained the plan to his sergeants before he explained it to anyone else. He believed that a soldier who understood why was worth 3 soldiers who only knew what. He carried a photograph of his wife Eleanor in his left breast pocket, positioned, as he told his platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Raymond Okafor, so that it would be the first thing a medic found if anything happened to him. "So she hears from someone who was there," he said. Okafor, 24, from Baltimore, Maryland, had never forgotten that detail. Hollis commanded a reinforced reconnaissance platoon, officially designated 1st Platoon, Company C, 134th Infantry Regiment. which had been temporarily attached to support the crossing operations at Arnaville. His unit numbered 22 men on September 10th. His mission: cross the Moselle ahead of the main force, penetrate the German defensive screen east of the river, identify enemy positions, and, critically, seize and hold the stone bridge at the village of Pont-à-Mousson. Long enough for the 35th Division's engineers to assess it as a viable crossing for armor. The bridge had been confirmed intact by an OSS informant 2 days earlier. According to this source, a local French resistance contact named Renard, the bridge was guarded by no more than a platoon-strength German force, perhaps 30 men. With no armor support, that intelligence was wrong. Nobody in the 12th Corps knew it yet. 40 kilometers east of where Hollis was studying his map, inside a requisitioned farmhouse near the village of Pagny-sur-Moselle, Oberst Heinrich Bauer of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division was briefing his company commanders on what he expected from the American crossing attempt. "They will come at the bridge directly," he told them, tracing the obvious route with one finger. "They have done this at every river since Normandy. They are aggressive, but they are not subtle. They follow roads because their vehicles require roads. They follow the path of least resistance because their doctrine tells them that speed compensates for everything." He paused, looked around the room. "They are correct that speed wins battles. They are incorrect about what speed means." His officers laughed. What Bauer did not tell his officers, what he likely did not believe himself, was that the force guarding Pont-à-Mousson was not 30 men. It was closer to 140. 2 full companies of Panzergrenadiers, a mortar section, and a platoon of armored half-tracks positioned in a horseshoe arrangement around the eastern approach to the bridge. Any American unit coming down the road would walk into a killing field. He had also, in the past 48 hours, sent patrols to secure the tree line north of the river, the tree line that Renard had identified as empty. It was not empty anymore. On September 12th, Hollis gathered his 22 men and gave them the plan. He also told them the one thing that bothered him about it. "The intel says the North Wood is clear," he said, spreading the map across the hood of a jeep. "I don't trust that. The North Wood is the only position from which someone could watch both the bridge and our approach route simultaneously. If I were them, that's where I'd be." Staff Sergeant Okafor looked at the map. "So we don't go straight at it." "We don't go straight at anything," Hollis said. "That's what they're waiting for." He didn't know yet how right he was. Part 2. The Trap Springs. They crossed the Moselle before dawn on September 13, 1944, in 2 rubber assault boats borrowed from the 320th Infantry Regiment. The river was 180 meters wide at the crossing point. The current was stronger than the map suggested. Private First Class Thomas Wiersbicki, 21, from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the platoon's best swimmer and, by his own accounting, the worst poker player in the regiment, nearly lost a boat to the current in the first crossing. He saved it by swimming alongside it for 60 meters in water that ran about 55 degrees. He never mentioned it afterward. They reached the eastern bank at 0347 and moved into the tree line without contact. This was the first sign that something was wrong, though Hollis didn't register it immediately. Where were the German listening posts? Every crossing operation he'd studied placed forward observers at the river's edge at night. The eastern bank of the Moselle in German hands should have had tripwires at minimum. There was nothing. The second sign came 400 meters into the march east, the road. The operational map showed a dirt track running southeast toward Pont-à-Mousson, passable but narrow, and what Hollis found instead was a road that had been recently widened. Fresh churning in the soil on both shoulders, trees cut back to allow wider vehicles to pass. Half-track tracks. Recent. Renard's information was 48 hours old. Okafor said quietly. More than that, Hollis said. This is 4 days of work minimum. He ordered a halt, sent Corporal Darren Speaks, 22, Galveston, Texas, former ranch hand, with an instinctive spatial awareness that Hollis had come to trust completely. Forward 200 meters to observe the bridge approach. Speaks came back in 11 minutes. The North Wood is full of them, he said. I counted 4 positions, probably more. And there's a farmhouse on the ridge. He pointed east. I could see light through the shutters. Officers. 22 Americans. 140 Germans. A killing ground designed to funnel them into a crossfire. And behind them, across the Moselle, a radio relay that had been quietly degrading since the crossing. Moisture in the transmitter, a problem Hollis had flagged 3 days ago and been told would be addressed before the mission. It had not been addressed. He keyed the handset. Static. He tried the alternate frequency. More static. He could hear something. Fragments, but nothing intelligible. Then the ambush hit. Not from the North Wood. From directly ahead, from positions that weren't on any map. From a drainage ditch that ran perpendicular to the road and that Hollis's map showed as dry and abandoned. It was neither. The first burst of MG-42 fire came at 0519, and it came from 15 meters away, which meant the German gunners had waited. Had watched the Americans stop, assess, send forward a scout, come back, hold their position. And had waited through all of it, knowing that patience would give them a better shot. That kind of discipline does not belong to a disorganized force. Private First Class Albert Drummond, 19, from Knoxville, Tennessee, was killed in the first 4 seconds. He was the platoon's radio operator, which was not a coincidence. Private Leon Metz, 26, from Tucson, Arizona, took a round through the left thigh that shattered his femur. He did not scream. He pulled himself behind a tree with his arms and started reloading his M1 with hands that shook only slightly. The unit scattered, correctly by training, moving laterally to break the kill zone. Hollis hit the ground behind a fallen oak, his mind doing the calculation that every officer in contact does. He knew the positions in the North Wood were not yet firing, which meant they were the second layer, waiting for the Americans to run north. The drainage ditch positions were the trigger. The North Wood was the trap. They were in a box. At 0531, the radio crackled once. A voice, Hollis recognized the call sign of 12th Corps operations, issued 8 words clearly enough to understand. All units Arnaville sector. Hold current positions. Repeat. Hold. The main crossing had been delayed. The artillery preparation that was supposed to suppress German positions across the entire sector. The preparation that Hollis's mission had been timed to proceed by 2 hours was postponed indefinitely. He was alone. The plan was gone. 2 men down in the first 12 minutes, and German positions on 3 sides, a river at his back that he couldn't cross without boats he'd left on the western bank. What do you do when the plan dies? Hollis had heard Patton's answer to that question delivered in person at a 3rd Army officer's briefing in August. He reached for it now in the dark, with German rounds hitting the oak he was pressed against. A like on this video takes 2 seconds. For the men who held that tree line while their plan fell apart, it is the least we can do. Part 3. The Patton Principle. An obstacle, Patton had said, standing in front of 200 officers in a field outside of Avranches on August 3, 1944, is information. It tells you exactly where the enemy has committed his mind. And a committed mind is a predictable mind. And a predictable mind is a defeated mind. He had paused, in looking at the assembled officers the way, as one lieutenant later wrote, a man looks at a map he's already memorized, checking to make sure it hasn't changed. Do not attack the obstacle, Patton continued. Read it. then attack what it forgot to protect. Hollis, pressed against that oak in the gray pre-dawn outside Pont-à-Mousson, ran this principle through what he knew. The Germans had committed three things. They had committed their ambush force in the drainage ditch to trigger the kill zone. They had committed their main strength in the North Wood to catch the Americans running from the trigger. And they had committed in positioning all of this to a single assumption: that the Americans would behave predictably, that they would come down the road, get hit, and run in one of two directions: back to the river or north into the secondary kill zone. What the Germans had not committed to, what they had not prepared, was the village. Hollis had noted the village of Saint-Martin-sur-Moselle on the map when he planned the route. It lay 500 meters south-southwest off the main approach, straddling a narrow farm lane that ran parallel to the river. The Germans had not placed listening posts there. Why would they? It was off the approach corridor. It was filled with French civilians who had been living under occupation for 4 years and who, from the German perspective, were a complication to be managed, not a tactical consideration. But the village sat on a limestone ridge, and that ridge had a direct line of sight to the eastern face of the Pont-à-Mousson bridge. Read the obstacle. It'd attack what it forgot to protect. Hollis crawled to Okafor, who had set up a base of fire behind a stone wall with 4 men and was keeping the drainage ditch position suppressed enough to prevent the Germans from maneuvering. "How long can you keep them from moving?" Hollis asked. 10 minutes before we're dry." "I need 12. Then break contact and follow our track south." Okafor looked at him. "South goes into the village." "Yes. There are civilians in there." "I know." This was the weight of it. The village of Saint-Martin-sur-Moselle had approximately 60 civilian inhabitants, French men, women, and children who had survived 4 years of German occupation and were 6 days away from American liberation. Moving a firefight into their streets was not a decision made lightly. Hollis had 5 seconds to make it, and he made it because the alternative was certain death for 20 men, and the failure of a crossing operation that would cost far more lives than any village firefight. He made it because he intended to move through the village, not fight in it, to use the buildings as cover while threading south to the ridge, not to turn French streets into a battlefield. And he made it because he had noticed in the faint pre-dawn light that the village buildings were dark. The civilians were not in the streets. They were behind stone walls that were 300 years old and had survived worse than whatever was about to happen. There was one more element: the deception. Private Speaks, the Texan who could read ground better than any man in the platoon, had grown up trailing cattle across South Texas. He knew what a trail was supposed to look like, and in 8 minutes, working with 2 other soldiers in a concealed position north of the oak line, he created one. Boot prints moving northeast into the brush, scattered equipment, a discarded ammunition pouch, one deliberately smashed ration tin. The kind of trail a panicking, disorganized unit left when it ran. Every item placed to tell a specific story. The Americans broke and ran north. The Germans in the North Wood would find it within minutes of the Americans withdrawing. They would follow it. They would commit their reserve to running down a ghost. If this story of Captain Hollis and the men of Company C has stayed with you, the channel that brings you these stories needs your subscription to keep going. Hit that button now before Part 4 takes over. What happened next took 4 hours. It nearly killed 8 men, and it changed what German commanders believed was possible. Part 4. The breaking point. 0537 hours. Hollis moved. Okafor's 4-man base of fire poured everything they had into the drainage ditch, disciplined 3-round bursts, conserving ammunition, making noise that suggested a larger force than it was. The Germans in the ditch kept their heads down. The North Wood waited. The main body, 16 men, moved south in a crouched file along the tree line, keeping the farm lane between themselves and the village. No lights, no noise beyond controlled breathing and the soft crunch of ground that Hollis cursed inwardly with every footfall. They reached the village edge at 0549. An old man stood at the corner of the first building, a stone farmhouse with a low door. He was perhaps 70, in wearing a heavy coat despite the September warmth. He looked at Hollis and the men behind him. He did not run. He did not call out. He pointed south along the village lane with one hand and held 2 fingers up with the other. 2 Germans. South end of the village. Hollis had not known they were there. The German positions had not included a village checkpoint on any of the maps or in Renard's intelligence. A 2-man checkpoint at the village's southern edge, small enough to miss, large enough to raise an alarm. He turned to Private First Class Amos Threadgill, 23, Macon, Georgia, the platoon's best close-quarters man. Threadgill looked at the old Frenchman. The old man held up 2 fingers again and mimed turning away, looking away, then pointed at his own ears. They're facing away and listening for the firefight, not for you. And 3 minutes later, the southern checkpoint was no longer a problem. At 0558, the platoon reached the limestone ridge. Hollis set eyes on the eastern face of Pont-à-Mousson Bridge for the first time. It was a beautiful bridge, 19th century stonework, arches that reflected in the dark water below. It was also occupied by a force far larger than anything in the intelligence briefing. He could see at least 4 vehicle positions on the road approach. Half-tracks. The mortar section was set up in a churchyard 60 meters back. He had 16 men. No artillery, no armor, no air support. The radio was dead. The main crossing was delayed indefinitely. And the North Wood, he could hear it now faintly, was starting to generate noise. The German reserve had found Speaks's trail and was moving. Yet he had perhaps 40 minutes before the deception was understood. Think about what that means. 40 minutes to take a bridge held by over 100 men with 16 soldiers, no support, running on 2 hours of sleep and the dregs of their ammunition load. Hollis did not attack the bridge. He attacked the mortar section. The German fire plan for the bridge depended on those mortars. Without them, the approach corridor could not be kept under plunging fire. Without plunging fire, a crossing force, even a small one, could suppress the vehicle positions long enough to reach the bridge itself. Hollis had read this in the terrain the same way his father had taught him to read a machine. Find the part without which nothing else works and start there. The assault on the mortar section took 8 minutes. It felt like 8 years. A Corporal Speaks led the first element through the churchyard wall. Dry stone, loose, loud, and the Germans on the mortar crew had exactly 2 seconds of warning. They used them. The crew chief, Hollis, would later estimate he had served on the Eastern Front based on the speed of his reaction. Got a flare-up before the position was overrun. It lit the churchyard white. The half-tracks turned. Hollis had expected this. He had placed his 3 best riflemen, Wiersbicki, Threadgill, and a private named Clarence Boyle, 20, from Shreveport, Louisiana, on the ridge behind him with orders to begin firing at any vehicle that turned a searchlight toward the churchyard. Not to destroy them, to blind the drivers. A half-track driver who cannot see does not move his vehicle into a position that makes him useful, and it worked for 90 seconds. Then Leon Metz, the man with the shattered femur who had dragged himself on his arms for 400 meters through the village rather than be left behind, rolled onto his back, looked up at Hollis and said, "Captain, I can still shoot," and put 3 rounds through the vision port of the lead half-track at 110 meters from a prone position with a broken leg. The half-track stopped moving. At 0641, in the chaos of the fight at the mortar section, with the German command structure fracturing between the firefight in the churchyard, the trail in the North Wood, and the sudden loss of their fire control capability, Hollis did the one thing that Bauer's entire defensive plan had not prepared for. He walked 17 of his men directly to the center of the bridge and sat down. Not attacked, not rushed, walked. Because the Germans, in the confusion, had left the bridge itself unguarded for 4 minutes. Every man had a specific assignment. The mortar section had been fighting Americans in the churchyard. The half-tracks had been trying to orient on a threat that moved like it was everywhere. The Northwood Reserve was 2 kilometers away chasing a ghost. 4 minutes was enough. Hollis held the bridge with 12 effective soldiers. 4 men were managing the wounded and the prisoner taken from the mortar position. For 1 hour and 23 minutes before the first radio relay from 12th Corps came through on the platoon's backup handset. Reinforcements were 6 hours away. He held it anyway. Staff Sergeant Okafor, who had broken contact from the drainage ditch position and brought his 4 men south exactly as ordered, he joined the bridge perimeter at 07:10 with 14 rounds of rifle ammunition remaining between all 4 of them. He found Hollis standing in the center of the bridge span, looking east. "It's done?" Okafor asked. "It's done," Hollis said. Then Okafor noticed that Hollis's left sleeve was dark from the elbow down. He had taken a round through the forearm at some point during the mortar assault and had not mentioned it. "When—" "Churchyard," Hollis said. "It doesn't matter. How are your men?" In the captured command post at Pagny-sur-Moselle, Oberst Bauer was dictating a message to the division staff that he would later describe, in a 1953 post-war memoir, as the most difficult report I was ever required to write. Part 5. The Verdict. The bridge at Pont-à-Mousson was formally secured by elements of the 35th Infantry Division's 134th Regiment at 1340 hours on September 13, 1944. What the engineers found when they reached the span looked nothing like a military victory is supposed to look. 17 Americans, most of whom had been awake for 31 consecutive hours. 4 wounded, 1 critically. Metz, whose femur required 3 surgeries and who would walk with a cane for the rest of his life. Ammunition loads averaging fewer than 20 rounds per man. 2 men asleep against the bridge railing in the September sun, rifles still in their hands. A Captain Hollis sitting on the stone parapet with his forearm wrapped in strips cut from a German soldier's field jacket, writing, of all things, in his field notebook. He was writing down exactly what had happened, in the order it had happened, while it was still precise in his mind. Not for his report. He wrote that first line. For Eleanor, in case the medic finds this instead. The 35th Division's engineers declared the bridge structurally sound at 1800 hours. By September 16th, elements of the 35th had crossed in force. Bauer's defensive line east of the Moselle had been breached not at the prepared killing ground, not at the obvious approach, but at the point the Germans had judged least likely, made possible by 17 men who had run toward a ghost they'd created themselves. 3 weeks after the battle, American intelligence officers processing captured German documents found Bauer's battle report from September 13th. The relevant passage, translated by Major Helen Wark of 12th Corps G2 section, read, "The American unit did not behave according to any known doctrine. They abandoned the expected approach, neutralized our indirect fire capability before engaging our primary positions, and occupied the objective through a gap we had not identified because we did not believe any unit that size would consider occupying it. I do not know what they were trained to do. I know what they actually did, and I have no adequate category for it." By 1953, Bauer, retired living in Munich, wrote with more candor. His memoir, never translated into English, included a chapter titled The Moselle, 1944. In it, he described the aftermath of Pont-à-Mousson as the moment he understood something he had dismissed at briefings in Berlin, that Patton's Third Army did not fight battles. It fought the space between battles, the moments when conventional doctrine said to stop, consolidate, wait for support. In those moments, Third Army accelerated. "We were trained to hold what we had taken," Bauer wrote. "They were trained to take what we thought could not be taken." Patton received the operational report on the Pont-à-Mousson crossing on September 14th. His annotation, written in the margin in red pencil, has been preserved at the Patton Archive at the Library of Congress. It reads, "This is what I mean. This, exactly." The principle he meant was the one he had articulated at Avranches in August in the tent, to 200 officers who were trying to write fast enough to get all of it down. Attack what the obstacle forgot to protect. The deception trail in the North Wood, the approach through the village, the assault on the mortar section rather than the defended perimeter. Everything Hollis had done was a translation of a single philosophical commitment. The obstacle tells you where the enemy has stopped thinking. Go there. James Hollis was promoted to major in October 1944. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He returned to Terre Haute, Indiana in October 1945 and went to work in his father's machine shop for 2 years before taking a position as a manufacturing engineer. He never gave a single public speech about the war. His field notebook, including the entry written on the bridge parapet, is held by the Indiana State Library in Indianapolis. Leon Metz walked with his cane for 41 years after the war. He died in Tucson in 1986. His son Michael served in Vietnam. His grandson James, named, his family says, for the officer who refused to leave him behind, served in Iraq. The bridge at Pont-à-Mousson still stands. You can walk across it. The limestone arches are exactly as they were in September 1944. And if you stand at the center of the span and look east toward the ridge where Wierzbicki and Threadgill and Boyle lay in the early morning light with their rifles, you can see exactly the angle of fire that stopped a half-track from turning into a position that would have ended everything. The ground still tells stories. The question is whether you know how to read them. If your father, grandfather, or great-grandfather served in the ETO, the Lorraine Campaign, 12th Corps, the Moselle crossings, any of it. I want to hear about it in the comments. What unit? What sector? What did they tell you and what did they never tell you? Those stories live in family memory and nowhere else. Put them here. The 134th Infantry Regiment, 35th Infantry Division, went on to fight in the Ardennes, the Rhineland, and Central Europe. 43 men from Company C were killed in action before VE Day. 11 were present at the German surrender ceremony at Bad Sulza on May 8, 1945. They stood at attention in a field in the rain and did not speak. Read those numbers again.